The phone call that stopped Mick Jagger was from a dead man. October 18, 1985. Backstage at the Los Angeles Forum, 17,000 fans were already screaming for the Rolling Stones. The band was supposed to hit the stage in exactly 12 minutes. Mick was doing his pre-show ritual, the stretches and vocal warm-ups that had become second nature after decades of performing. The energy backstage was electric, roadies making final adjustments, Keith tuning his guitar one last time. Then the phone rang. Not a cell phone, those didn't exist yet. The backstage landline, the one reserved for absolute emergencies only. The tour manager, Bill Graham, picked it up with visible annoyance. They were minutes away from showtime, and nothing should be interrupting their preparation. But when Bill answered, his face went completely white. "Mick," Bill said, his voice shaking in a way that made everyone stop what they were doing. "This call is for you, and you need to take it right now. Something's wrong. Bill's seen everything in this business, and he looks like he's seen a ghost." "We go on in 10 minutes, Mick protested, but Bill was already handing him the receiver with a trembling hand. "Trust me," Bill whispered. "Take the call." What Mick heard next made his blood run cold. "Hello, Michael." The voice on the other end was crackling with static, distant, but unmistakably familiar. It was a voice Mick hadn't heard in 3 decades. A voice that belonged to someone who had been dead since 1955. Brian Epworth, his first music teacher. The man who had discovered Mick's talent when he was just 8 years old. The man who had died in a car crash when Mick was 11, taking secrets to his grave that Mick had spent his entire life trying to forget. "This isn't possible," Mick whispered, his hand gripping the phone so tight his knuckles went white. Around him, the backstage chaos continued, but he felt like he was in a bubble of impossible silence. "I know what you're thinking," the voice continued, "but you need to listen very carefully, Michael. In exactly 7 minutes, don't go on that stage. If you do, something terrible is going to happen. Something that will destroy everything you've built." The line went dead, but the warning was just the beginning of the nightmare. Mick stood frozen, the dead phone still pressed to his ear. Keith noticed something was wrong immediately. In all their years together, through drugs, arrests, and countless crises, he'd never seen Mick look like this. Pale, shaking, like he'd aged 10 years in 10 seconds. "What is it?" Keith asked, but Mick couldn't speak. How could he explain that he'd just received a warning from a man who'd been dead for 30 years? Brian's voice. Exactly the same. That slight Welsh accent, the way he called me Michael, never Mick. "But Brian is dead. I went to his funeral. I saw them lower the coffin. 5 minutes until showtime." The crowd was getting restless, their chants growing louder. The other band members were ready, instruments in hand, waiting for their frontman to lead them onto the stage. But Mick couldn't move. "I can't go on," Mick finally said, his voice barely audible. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Charlie Watts dropped his drumsticks. Ronnie Wood's jaw fell open. Keith grabbed Mick by the shoulders. "What do you mean you can't go on? There's 17,000 people out there. Something's going to happen," Mick said. "Something terrible." Based on what? A phone call? How could he tell them the truth? That a dead man had just warned him about tonight. They'd think he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. 3 minutes until showtime. What nobody knew was the secret Brian had taken to his grave. The truth was, Brian Epworth had been more than just Mick's music teacher. He'd been the keeper of a secret that could have destroyed Mick's life before it even began. A secret about what really happened the night before Brian died, and why an 8-year-old Mick Jagger had blood on his hands. Nobody knows about that night. Nobody alive. Brian promised he'd never tell, and then he died the next day. The police said it was an accident, but I always wondered. It had been October 17, 1955. Exactly 30 years ago yesterday. Young Michael Jagger had been at Brian's house for a late piano lesson. Brian's wife was away, and something had happened that night that changed everything. Something that ended with Brian making a phone call that saved Mick's life but cost him his own. "Mick," Bill Graham was practically screaming now. "We need you on stage now." But Mick was lost in memories he'd spent 3 decades trying to suppress. The sound of breaking glass. Brian's voice, urgent and protective. "Michael, hide in the closet. Don't come out no matter what you hear." The footsteps on the stairs. The muffled conversation. Then the silence that seemed to last forever. When Brian finally let him out of the closet, there was blood on the piano keys. Not Brian's blood. Someone else's. Someone who had come to the house that night with bad intentions and left in an ambulance. "It's okay, Michael," Brian had said, wiping the blood away. "You're safe now, but you can never tell anyone about tonight. Promise me." Mick had promised. The next day, Brian died when his car went off a cliff on a clear morning with no other vehicles involved. 1 minute until showtime. Then Mick saw something that confirmed his worst fears. Through the gap in the stage curtains, Mick could see the audience. Row after row of excited fans, but his eyes were drawn to one specific seat. Section A, Row 5, Seat 23. The exact seat where someone special was supposed to be sitting tonight. His daughter Jade, who had surprised him by flying in from New York. But Jade wasn't in her seat. Instead, there was a man. A man wearing a 1950s-style suit and hat, facing away from the stage. Even from behind, even after 30 years, Mick recognized him. It was Brian Epworth. As if sensing Mick's gaze, the figure slowly began to turn around. Time seemed to slow as Mick waited to see the face of a man who couldn't possibly be there. "That's it, we're going on without you," Keith snapped, heading for the stage. But Mick grabbed his arm with desperate strength. "Look at Section A, Row 5, Seat 23, Mick said urgently. "Tell me what you see." Keith humored him, peering through the curtain. "Empty seat," he said. "Your daughter must be running late." Empty. Keith saw an empty seat where Mick saw Brian. "I'm losing my mind. The stress, the tours, the decades of excess. It's finally catching up. But what if I'm not crazy? What if Brian really is trying to warn me?" The crowd was now chanting, "Stones, Stones, Stones." The sound was deafening. Security guards were starting to look concerned. In all their years, the Rolling Stones had never delayed a show like this. 0 minutes. They should be on stage. Mick made a decision that would haunt him forever. "We're going on," Mick announced suddenly. "But I need to do something first." Before anyone could stop him, Mick walked to the backstage phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. His daughter Jade's hotel. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Each ring felt like an eternity. Finally, a voice answered. "Not Jade." The hotel manager. "I'm sorry, Mr. Jagger," the manager said, his voice strange. "There's been an incident. Your daughter, there was an accident on the way to the venue. A car ran a red light. The paramedics are with her now." The phone slipped from Mick's hand. Brian's warning echoed in his mind. Something terrible is going to happen. But the real shock came with what the manager said next. "The strange thing is," the manager continued, his voice coming from the dropped phone, "witnesses say another car pushed her vehicle out of the way at the last second. Saved her life. The driver of that car, they say he was wearing a 1950s suit. But when police arrived, the car and driver had vanished. They found only one thing at the scene." Mick picked up the phone with trembling hands. What did they find? A piano key. An old one, with what looks like dried blood on it. The same piano key from Brian's house. The one Mick had kept hidden for 30 years. The one he'd brought to LA as a good luck charm. The one that had been in his hotel safe just hours ago. Brian. He took the key. He saved Jade. Just like he saved me all those years ago. "Mr. Jagger," the manager was saying, "your daughter is asking for you. She keeps saying something about a man who told her to tell you the debt is paid." Mick's revelation changed everything he believed about death. The show went on. Somehow, Mick found the strength to perform, knowing his daughter was safe in the hospital with minor injuries instead of dead. But throughout the concert, he kept seeing Brian in the audience. Not in seat 23, but moving through the crowd, always watching, always protecting. During "Sympathy for the Devil," Mick saw him clearly. Brian was standing at the back of the venue, and for the first time, they made eye contact. Brian smiled, the same gentle smile he'd given 8-year-old Michael after every successful piano lesson. Then he mouthed 2 words, "You're safe." The truth about that night in 1955 finally made sense. The man who had come to Brian's house hadn't been there for Brian. He'd been there for young Michael Jagger. Brian's young student who'd witnessed something he shouldn't have seen. Something connected to his father's work at the gymnasium, where money had gone missing and accusations were flying. Brian had died protecting him. And now, 30 years later, he'd returned to protect Mick's daughter. But why now? Why October 18, 1985? The answer came during the encore. As the band launched into "You Can't Always Get What You Want," a woman approached the stage barrier. Security moved to stop her, but something made them freeze. She was elderly, probably in her 70s, but she moved with purpose. She was holding something. A photograph. Even from the stage, Mick could see it clearly. It showed a young Brian Epworth standing next to a piano, with 8-year-old Michael Jagger beside him. But there was someone else in the photo. A woman. Brian's sister, Margaret. The elderly woman at the barrier was Margaret Epworth. She held up something else. A letter. Using every ounce of his performance training, Mick managed to continue singing while reading the letter she pressed against the barrier. "Michael, It read, "Brian made me promise to give you this on October 18, 1985. He said you'd understand why. He knew things, saw things. The accident that killed him, he knew it was coming. He chose it to protect you, but he also knew he'd need to protect you again. Today, your daughter was meant to die tonight. Brian made a deal to prevent it. The same deal he made 30 years ago. Some debts transcend death. Some promises are eternal. Look after your family, Michael. Brian can't protect them anymore. His work is done." The letter burst into flames the moment Mick finished reading it. Margaret smiled sadly, nodded once, and disappeared into the crowd. When security tried to follow her, she was gone. Witnesses disagreed on what she looked like, how tall she was, even what she was wearing. Later, Mick learned that Margaret Epworth had died in 1962. The final revelation came at 3 a.m. After the show, after visiting Jade in the hospital, after holding his daughter and crying with relief, Mick returned to his hotel room. On his pillow was the bloody piano key. Next to it, a note in Brian's handwriting. "The man who tried to kill you in 1955 had a son. That son became a truck driver. Tonight, he was drunk and running a red light when fate put Jade in his path. The circle was meant to close with her death. I broke the circle. The debt from 1955 is paid. You're free now, Michael. Both of you. Make it count." When Mick picked up the piano key, it crumbled to dust in his hands. The note faded like it had never existed. But on his nightstand, his phone rang one last time. "Thank you for the music, Michael," Brian's voice said, clearer than it had been earlier. "Thank you for becoming everything I knew you could be. But remember, I didn't save you so you could waste your life, or so you could forget where you came from. Every song you sing, sing it like it matters. Because it does." "Brian," Mick whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry. For everything. No apologies needed. Just remember, the dead don't always leave. Sometimes we stay to finish what we started. Take care of Jade. Take care of yourself. And Michael, next time you play piano, play it like I taught you. With your whole heart." The line went dead. This time, Mick knew it was forever. The transformation was immediate and permanent. From that night forward, Mick Jagger was a different performer. Critics noticed it immediately. The wild man of rock and roll had been replaced by something deeper, more purposeful. Every show carried weight, meaning, intention. He stopped going through the motions and started performing like each concert might be his last. He also became obsessed with safety. His own, his band's, his family's, his fans'. Some called it paranoia, but those close to him knew better. He'd learned that death was not always the end, and that some protections came from beyond the grave. But he'd also learned that such protection was rare, precious, and not to be taken for granted. Jade recovered fully from her injuries. She never remembered the crash clearly, but she had recurring dreams of a man in a 1950s suit standing between her car and the truck, his hands raised as if conducting an invisible orchestra. In the dreams, she could hear piano music, songs she'd never heard before but somehow knew by heart. The real change was in Mick's music. He started writing songs about second chances, about debts that transcend death, about the thin line between this world and the next. Critics called it his spiritual phase, but Mick knew better. He was simply writing what he now knew to be true, that love doesn't die with the body, that protection can come from unexpected places, and that sometimes the dead are more alive than the living. He also started a foundation in Brian Epworth's name. Not publicly, not for acclaim, but quietly. It helped young musicians who reminded him of himself at 8 years old. Kids with talent but also with secrets, with dangers they didn't fully understand. The foundation provided not just musical education but protection, safety, sanctuary. Every October 18th, Mick would visit a piano. Any piano. He'd sit down and play the pieces Brian had taught him all those years ago. Simple pieces, children's exercises, nothing like the complex rock arrangements he was famous for. But he played them with his whole heart, just like Brian had taught him. And sometimes, if the light was just right and the world was quiet enough, he could swear he heard another piano joining his, playing harmony to his melody. A teacher still teaching, even from beyond. The final proof came years later. In 2015, 30 years after that night at the Forum, Mick was going through old tour archives when he found something that made his blood run cold. Security footage from October 18, 1985. The camera had been positioned to watch the backstage area, but it had caught a reflection in a mirror. A reflection of Section A, Row 5, Seat 23. The seat wasn't empty. There was a figure there, just as Mick had seen. But the truly chilling part was what the figure was doing. He was holding up a watch, pointing at it urgently. The time on the watch, 8:47 p.m. The exact time Jade's accident would have killed her if not for the mysterious intervention. Mick had the footage analyzed by experts. They confirmed it hadn't been doctored. They also confirmed something else. The figure in the seat cast no shadow, affected no one around him, and appeared in only 3 frames of film. Frames that, according to the time code, were captured at the exact moment the backstage phone had rung. Brian Epworth had found a way to warn him, had found a way to save Jade, had found a way to pay a debt that had haunted both of them for decades. The footage was destroyed in a fire 2 days later. The only copy vanished from a locked vault. But Mick didn't need proof anymore. He had lived it. Some gifts transcend death. Some teachers never stop teaching. And some phone calls, even from the dead, must be answered. The man who called Mick Jagger that night in 1985 had been dead for 30 years. But death, Mick learned, is not always the end of the story. Sometimes it's just a change in the way the story is told. And Brian Epworth, music teacher, protector, and friend, had found a way to finish the story he'd started in 1955. A story of a young boy with a gift, a teacher who saw potential, and a sacrifice that echoed across decades. The Stones played on for decades more, but Mick never forgot that night. Never forgot that the dead watch over us, that old debts get paid in mysterious ways, and that sometimes, just sometimes, a phone call from the past can save the future. Brian Epworth saved Mick Jagger twice. Once in life, once in death. And in doing so, he proved that the most powerful force in the universe isn't fame or fortune or even music itself. It's love. The kind that transcends death, defies logic, and refuses to let go until everyone is safe. The phone that rang that night in 1985 shouldn't have been able to connect the living and the dead. But it did. Because some bonds are stronger than death, and some promises echo in eternity. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, Brian Epworth finally rested. His student was safe. His debt was paid. The music would play on, just as he'd always known it would.